August 26, 1991, 7:32 p.m. The Soviet flag descended from the Kremlin's highest point for the final time. 74 years of red banners, hammer and sickle, the symbol that terrified half the world, gone. In its place, the Russian tricolor rose, white, blue, red, the colors of the empire before the empire. Rewind 7 days. On August 19th, the Soviet Union still existed. An empire that ruled from Berlin to Vladivostok, a military machine with 40,000 nuclear warheads, a superpower that had fought the West to a standstill for half a century. 7 days later, it was over. The question haunted the world then. It haunts us now. How did a superpower collapse in a week? The answer lies in 7 days in August. 7 days when desperate men gambled everything to save the Soviet Union. 7 days when that gamble destroyed it instead. This is the story of the coup that killed an empire. 1. The Gathering Storm. Spring 1991. The Soviet Union was hemorrhaging territory. Lithuania declared independence in March. Latvia and Estonia followed. Ukraine scheduled a referendum for December. Everyone knew the result before the vote. The empire that Stalin built, that Brezhnev expanded, that terrified the West for generations, was coming apart. Mikhail Gorbachev had unleashed forces he couldn't control. Glasnost, openness, exposed the regime's lies. The people learned about Stalin's purges, about the gulags, about the manufactured famines. Perestroika, restructuring, shattered the command economy. Factories closed, shelves emptied, the promise of communist abundance revealed as a 70-year con. In the corridors of power, panic spread, not among reformers, among the men who built their lives on Soviet power, the hardliners. Vladimir Khrushchev, KGB chairman, a man who spent his career in the shadows, who believed information was power, who watched Glasnost destroy the very secrecy that made the KGB untouchable. Dmitry Yazov, defense minister, a World War II veteran who remembered when the Red Army liberated Europe, who couldn't comprehend a world where Soviet military might didn't matter. Boris Pugo, interior minister, a Latvian who rose through the Communist Party ranks, who saw his own republic turning against Moscow, who took it personally. These men shared a conviction. Gorbachev's weakness would destroy the motherland. His reforms had opened Pandora's box. The republics were escaping. The economy was collapsing. The military was demoralized. Worse, the people were losing faith. The hardliners believed they knew what the Soviet people truly wanted. Not freedom, order, not democracy, stability, not choice, certainty. They believed the chaos of 1991 proved their point. Given the choice between liberty and bread, people would choose bread. They were forming a plan, a desperate plan, a final plan, but they were making a fatal miscalculation. They were planning a 1960s coup in a 1991 world. They assumed the old rules still applied. They assumed the military would obey without question. They assumed the people would submit to authority. They assumed they could turn back history with tanks and emergency decrees. They were wrong about everything. The conspiracy began in whispers, coded phone calls, meetings in KGB safe houses, conversations that started with "what if" and ended with "we have no choice." By summer 1991, the whispers became plans. The plans became preparations. But these men faced a problem. A coup requires legitimacy. It requires a figurehead, someone to sign the orders, someone to appear on television and reassure the nation that everything was under control. They needed someone weak enough to control, someone desperate enough to cooperate, someone with just enough authority to make it look legal. They found their man in the most unlikely place, not in the military, not in the KGB, in the office next to Gorbachev's. Vice President Gennady Yanayev was about to become the face of a coup he didn't plan, couldn't lead, and would ultimately destroy him. 2. The reluctant puppet. Gennady Yanayev was nobody's first choice for anything. Not for vice president, not for leadership, certainly not for saving the Soviet Union. He was an alcoholic. Everyone knew it. The trembling hands, the bloodshot eyes, the vodka breath at morning meetings. He was weak-willed, desperate for approval, a man who spent his career saying yes to powerful people and hoping they'd remember him kindly. Gorbachev had chosen him as vice president for exactly those reasons. A non-threatening deputy, someone who wouldn't challenge him, someone who could be trusted because he had no ambition beyond survival. The hardliners saw something different. They saw a man who would sign whatever they put in front of him, a man who craved authority but lacked the spine to wield it, a man who would provide constitutional cover for their coup while they made the real decisions. Perfect. August 1991. The meetings intensified. KGB safe houses in Moscow's outskirts, dacha compounds where the walls didn't have ears. The conspiracy took shape around kitchen tables and in secure rooms, always in whispers, always with coded language. The structure emerged. 8 men, the core of Soviet power, or what remained of it. Yanayev would be the figurehead, vice president assuming power from an incapacitated president. Khrushchev would control information, the KGB monitoring everything, suppressing dissent before it spread. Yazov would command the military, tanks in the streets, soldiers at key positions, the visible fist of authority. Pugo would handle internal security, police, interior ministry troops, the apparatus of domestic control. 4 others joined them. Valentin Pavlov, the Prime Minister. Oleg Baklanov, Defense Industry Chief. Vasily Starodubtsev, Farmers' Union Leader. Alexander Tiziakov, Industrial Association President. Men who represented the Soviet establishment, the bureaucracy that depended on the system's survival. Together they called themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency, the Russian acronym GKCHP, a name that would become synonymous with failure. Their plan was straightforward: detain Gorbachev, declare a state of emergency, suspend the reforms, restore order, save the Soviet Union. They believed it would work because it had always worked. Coup attempts in 1957, 1964. The party apparatus moving against leaders who threatened the system. Khrushchev ousted, Brezhnev installed, the machine protecting itself. But those coups happened in secret. Kremlin power struggles resolved behind closed doors. The public learned about them after they were over, presented with new leadership as a fait accompli. This coup would be different. It would happen in full view. Tanks in Moscow streets, announcements on state television, the world watching in real time. The hardliners didn't see the problem. They were planning a 1960s coup, secretive, swift, surgical, in a 1991 world. A world with CNN broadcasting live from Moscow. A world where glasnost had taught people to question official narratives. A world where Gorbachev's reforms, however chaotic, had given people a taste of something the Soviet system never offered: choice. They didn't understand that you can't put that back in the bottle. You can't make people unknow what they've learned. You can't restore faith in a system that exposed its own lies. By mid-August, the preparations were complete. The emergency decrees drafted, the military units identified, the television announcements written. Yanayev rehearsed his lines, hands shaking, glass of vodka nearby for courage. On August 18th, they made their move. The target wasn't in Moscow. Gorbachev had left for vacation, the Black Sea coast, his dacha in Foros, Crimea, isolated, vulnerable, perfect. The conspirators sent a delegation, trusted men. Men Gorbachev had worked with for years, men he would never suspect. They were about to make Mikhail Gorbachev a prisoner in his own country, and in doing so, they were about to trigger the very collapse they were trying to prevent. 3. Crimean captivity, August 18, 1991, 4:47 p.m. Mikhail Gorbachev reached for the phone in his Crimean dacha. He wanted to call Moscow, check in with his office, handle some paperwork before dinner. The line was dead. He tried another phone, dead. The government hotline, dead. Every phone in the compound, silent. Gorbachev walked to the window. His security detail had changed. New faces, men he didn't recognize. They weren't looking outward, scanning for threats. They were looking inward. At him. He turned to Raisa, his wife. Something's wrong. Minutes later, the delegation arrived. 5 men. Oleg Baklanov, defense industry chief. Valery Boldin, Gorbachev's own chief of staff. Oleg Shenin, party official. General Valentin Varenikov, ground forces commander. Yuri Plekhanov, KGB security chief. Men Gorbachev had worked with for years. Men he trusted. Men who were about to make him a prisoner. They didn't waste time on pleasantries. Baklanov spoke first. The situation in Moscow was critical. The republics were in chaos. The economy was collapsing. The military was losing control. A state of emergency was necessary. Gorbachev needed to sign the decree. Transfer power to the emergency committee. Temporarily, just until order was restored. Gorbachev's response was immediate. No. The delegation tried persuasion. The country was falling apart. His reforms had failed. The people were suffering. This was the only way to save the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's answer didn't change. No. They tried threats, subtle at first, then direct. He could sign the decree voluntarily, or he could be declared incapacitated. Either way, the emergency committee would assume power. His cooperation would make it easier. For everyone. Gorbachev stood. Get out. The delegation left. But they didn't leave the compound. They took positions outside. Guards at every exit. Patrols on the beach. Boats offshore. The dacha had become a prison. Raisa Gorbachev watched her husband pace the room. She'd seen him face down hardliners before, seen him navigate party politics, seen him stare down the Soviet establishment and win. This was different. They were cut off. No phones, no communication with Moscow, no way to warn anyone, no way to stop what was coming. She asked the question that terrified her. What will they do to us? Gorbachev didn't answer. He didn't know. History offered precedents, none of them good. Khrushchev, ousted in 1964, spent his final years under house arrest, erased from official history. Others had faced worse. The Gorbachevs spent the evening in isolation. No television, the signal was cut. No radio, jammed. No contact with their children, their staff, the outside world. Just silence and the sound of guards' boots on gravel paths. Night fell over for us. Inside the dacha, Mikhail Gorbachev understood what was happening in Moscow. A coup against him, by men he'd appointed, men he'd trusted. He'd spent 6 years trying to reform the Soviet Union. 6 years of glasnost and perestroika. 6 years of walking a tightrope between hardliners who wanted to preserve the system and radicals who wanted to destroy it. Now the hardliners had made their move, and Gorbachev sat trapped, 1,500 kilometers from Moscow, unable to stop them. But the conspirators had made a critical error. They assumed Gorbachev's absence would create a vacuum they could fill. They assumed the Soviet people would accept the official story. They assumed no one would resist. They were wrong. While Gorbachev sat imprisoned in Crimea, Moscow was waking to a new reality. Tanks in the streets, an emergency announcement, a trembling vice president claiming power, and one man was about to decide that he wouldn't accept it. One man who would climb onto a tank and change history. Boris Yeltsin was about to answer the question the coup plotters never asked. What if someone fights back? 4. The morning everything changed. August 19th, 1991, 6 a.m. Moscow woke to the sound of tank treads on asphalt. Muscovites stumbled to their windows, rubbed their eyes, looked again. Columns of T-72 tanks rolling down Tverskaya Street, armored personnel carriers at major intersections, soldiers in full combat gear taking positions around government buildings. This wasn't a parade, this wasn't a drill, this was an occupation. State television interrupted regular programming, solemn music, the kind that played when general secretaries died. Then the announcement. Mikhail Gorbachev was ill, unable to perform his duties. The vice president, in accordance with the constitution, had assumed power. A state committee on the state of emergency had been formed to restore order. Citizens were instructed to remain calm. Everything was under control. The official story was a lie. Everyone knew it immediately. Gorbachev wasn't ill. He was 59 years old, healthy, vigorous. He'd been on television 3 days earlier looking perfectly fine. The announcement didn't pass the most basic credibility test. But the tanks were real. The soldiers were real. The state of emergency was real. At noon, the emergency committee held their first press conference. International journalists packed the hall. CNN broadcast live to the world. Western leaders watched from Washington, London, Paris, trying to understand what was happening to the Soviet Union. Gennady Yanayev walked to the podium. The man who was supposedly now in charge of a nuclear superpower. The man who would explain to the world why this was necessary. His hands trembled. Visibly, uncontrollably. He reached for a glass of water, lifted it. The water sloshed. He set it down without drinking. Tried again. Failed again. A journalist asked the obvious question. Where is Gorbachev? What exactly is wrong with him? Yanayev's answer was rehearsed, unconvincing. He is tired. He needs rest. He will return when he has recovered. Another question. Is this a coup? Yanayev's face flushed. No, this is a constitutional transfer of power, temporary measures to address the crisis. The journalists didn't believe him. More importantly, the Soviet people watching on television didn't believe him. A leader who couldn't hold a glass of water steady. A vice president who looked terrified of his own press conference. A story that made no sense. The emergency committee had a problem. They'd seized power. They'd deployed the military. They'd taken control of state media. But they hadn't won the most important battle, credibility. In apartments across Moscow, people made a calculation. The same calculation that determines the success or failure of every coup. Do we accept this? Do we submit? Do we go to work, keep our heads down, wait for it to blow over? Or do we resist? The atmosphere in Moscow that morning was confusion, mixed with fear, mixed with something the plotters hadn't anticipated. Defiance. Small groups gathered on street corners, whispering, watching the tanks, not running, not hiding, standing, looking at the soldiers. Young conscripts, 18 and 19 years old, who looked more confused than the civilians. The critical hours had begun. Would the military follow orders? Would they fire on their own people if commanded? Would the coup succeed through sheer force, or would it collapse under its own contradictions? The emergency committee sat in the Kremlin, watching reports come in. Tanks in position, key buildings secured, no significant resistance, everything according to plan. But they were watching the wrong thing. They were counting tanks and soldiers. They should have been watching the people in the streets. They should have been watching one man in particular. Boris Yeltsin was awake. He'd been woken at 5 a.m. by aides with news of the coup. He'd spent an hour making phone calls, gathering information, understanding the situation. Now he faced the decision that would define his life, the decision that would determine whether the Soviet Union survived or died. Fight or flee. He chose to fight. 5. The man on the tank, 10 a.m. Boris Yeltsin's motorcade arrived at the Russian White House, not the Kremlin, that belonged to the Soviet government, to Gorbachev, to the coup plotters now. The White House was the Russian Federation's parliament building, a symbol of the republic's growing independence from Soviet control. Yeltsin stepped out of his car, 60 years old, built like a bear, a man who'd spent his career fighting the party establishment, a man Gorbachev had once fired for being too radical, too confrontational, too dangerous to the system. Now he was the system's last hope. Thousands had already gathered. Word spread through Moscow faster than the coup plotters could control it. No official announcement, no organization, just people arriving at the White House because they understood what was happening. The old guard was trying to take back power. Someone needed to stop them. Yeltsin walked toward the crowd. His security team tried to hold him back. Too dangerous. Snipers could be anywhere. The military could open fire. This was insane. Yeltsin ignored them. He saw a tank. Tank number 110, part of the Taman division, positioned to prevent anyone from entering or leaving the White House. The crew stood nearby, young conscripts smoking cigarettes, watching the growing crowd with uncertain eyes. Yeltsin walked straight to the tank, climbed onto the hull, pulled himself up to the turret, stood on top of a Soviet tank, facing the crowd, facing the soldiers, facing the Kremlin across the Moscow River. The crowd fell silent. Yeltsin didn't have a prepared speech, no teleprompter, no script, just rage at what was happening and the words that came from it. Citizens of Russia, the legally elected president of this country has been removed from power. This is a coup. We do not recognize it. We will not submit to it. His voice carried across the square, rough, defiant, unpolished, nothing like Gorbachev's careful, measured rhetoric. You cannot rule by bayonets. You cannot turn back history with tanks. The old order will never return. We will resist. We will fight. We call on the military to refuse illegal orders. We call on the people to defend democracy. The crowd erupted, not just applause, a roar, thousands of voices answering Yeltsin's defiance with their own. But the most important sound came from below. The tank commander, a young officer named Alexander Lebed, climbed onto the turret next to Yeltsin. He saluted. Not the coup plotters, not the emergency committee, Yeltsin. We will not fire on our own people, Lebed said. That moment changed everything. A tank commander choosing which orders to obey. A soldier deciding that his loyalty was to Russia, not to whoever controlled the Kremlin. A young officer understanding that history was watching and choosing the right side. Other tank crews followed. One by one, the Taman division tanks repositioned, not surrounding the White House to prevent escape, surrounding it to prevent attack. The soldiers who were supposed to enforce the coup became its first line of defense against it. The crowd grew. By afternoon, 10,000 people surrounded the White House. By evening, 50,000, students and veterans, workers and intellectuals, babushkas who remembered Stalin, and teenagers who'd grown up under glasnost. Moscow's unlikely army. They built barricades, trolley buses, construction materials, anything that could slow an assault. They formed human chains around the building. They sang. They chanted. They waited. Inside the Kremlin, the emergency committee watched their carefully planned takeover unravel in real time. They'd deployed the military. They'd seized control of state media. They'd followed the playbook, but they'd forgotten one thing. In 1991, the playbook didn't work anymore. You couldn't control information when CNN broadcast live from Moscow. You couldn't suppress dissent when thousands gathered in defiance. You couldn't rule by force when your own soldiers refused to fire. The coup was failing, not in days, in hours. But defiance alone wouldn't stop tanks if the order came to attack. The real battle wasn't happening in the streets. It was happening inside military headquarters, in secure rooms where generals were asking themselves a question that would determine whether the Soviet Union survived the night. Do we fire on our own people? 6. The general's dilemma. The coup's entire strategy rested on a single assumption. The military would obey without question. Soviet generals would receive orders from the emergency committee and execute them. Tanks would roll, soldiers would fire, resistance would be crushed, order would be restored. That assumption was wrong. Inside military headquarters across Moscow, generals stared at orders they didn't want to follow. Storm the White House, disperse the crowds, arrest Yeltsin, use whatever force necessary. The words on paper were clear. The reality on the ground was not. General Pavel Grachev commanded the airborne forces, elite troops, the best trained soldiers in the Soviet military, men who'd fought in Afghanistan, men who followed orders without hesitation. Grachev received his instructions directly from Defense Minister Yazov. Take the White House, neutralize Yeltsin, end the resistance. Grachev drove to the White House himself, walked through the crowds, saw the barricades, saw the defenders, students holding hands, veterans wearing their medals, families with children, 50,000 people who believed they were protecting democracy. He returned to headquarters, called Yazov, delivered his assessment. I will not order my men to fire on Russian citizens. Yazov's response was fury. This was insubordination. This was treason. This was a direct order from the defense minister. Grachev's answer was simple. Then you come here and give the order yourself. Yazov didn't come. The same conversation happened in command centers across the military. Generals who'd spent their careers following orders were suddenly asking questions they'd never asked before. Do we fire on our own people? The memory of Tiananmen Square haunted every discussion. June 1989. Chinese tanks crushing pro-democracy protesters in Beijing. The world watched in horror. The Chinese Communist Party survived, but at a cost. The images of that massacre defined China for a generation. Soviet generals had studied Tiananmen. They'd analyzed the tactics. They'd noted what worked from a military perspective. But they'd also seen what it cost: the international condemnation, the economic sanctions, the moral stain that wouldn't wash away. More importantly, they'd seen something else. In 1989, the Chinese military obeyed orders. In 1991, Soviet soldiers were fraternizing with protesters. Tank crews were repositioning to protect the White House, not attack it. Conscripts were accepting food and cigarettes from the crowds they were supposed to disperse. The coup plotters had one final option: the KGB's Alpha Group, elite special forces, the most highly trained soldiers in the Soviet Union, men who conducted operations that never appeared in official records, men who didn't question orders. Alpha Group received their instructions: assault the White House, capture or kill Yeltsin, end this. The unit's commander, General Viktor Karpukhin, assembled his men, reviewed the plan, calculated the requirements. The White House had 50,000 defenders, mostly civilians, but some were armed. Some were veterans who knew how to fight. The building itself was a fortress, concrete and steel, designed to withstand attack. A successful assault would require overwhelming force. It would require killing hundreds of people, maybe thousands. It would require Alpha Group soldiers firing into crowds of Russian citizens. It would require turning Moscow into a battlefield. Karpukin ran the numbers. He considered the tactics. He thought about the orders. Then he asked the question that broke the coup. Who gives that order? Who takes that responsibility? Not Yanayev. He was a puppet, everyone knew it. Not the emergency committee. They were bureaucrats playing at being revolutionaries. Not even Yazov. He'd already proven he wouldn't come to the White House himself. Who would stand in front of the cameras afterward and explain why hundreds of Russian citizens died? Who would justify the massacre? Who would take responsibility for the blood? No one answered. Alpha Group stood down. By nightfall, August 19th, the coup was already failing. Not because of military defeat, because of a question no one could answer, because generals refused to fire on their own people, because the hardliners had planned for everything except the possibility that their own military would say no. The emergency committee sat in the Kremlin, watching their power evaporate. They'd seized control of the government. They'd deployed tanks across Moscow. They'd declared a state of emergency, but they couldn't make anyone obey. 7. The longest night. August 19th, 10 p.m. Darkness fell over Moscow. The White House glowed under floodlights. 50,000 people remained. No one went home. No one believed the danger had passed. The barricades grew higher. Trolley buses formed the outer ring. Behind them, construction materials, steel beams, concrete barriers, anything heavy. Behind those, the human shields. Rows of people linking arms, forming chains around the building. The defenders organized themselves. Veterans took command positions. Men who'd fought in Afghanistan, who understood tactics, who knew how to prepare for assault. Students ran supplies, food, water, medical kits. Intellectuals drafted statements, prepared documents, recorded everything for history. Inside the White House, Yeltsin and his team prepared for the worst. They wrote final statements, messages to be released if they were killed or captured, testaments to what they were fighting for, evidence of the coup for the world to see. The atmosphere was tense but not panicked. These people had made their choice. They would defend democracy or die trying. There was clarity in that, purpose. Outside, the military waited. Tanks idled at intersections. Armored personnel carriers blocked major roads. Soldiers stood at their posts, watching the crowds, wondering if the order would come. Around midnight, it almost did. 3 armored vehicles approached the White House. Not the careful, disciplined movement of a planned assault. Aggressive, fast, as if the crews had decided on their own to break through. The crowd saw them coming, moved to block their path, formed human barriers in front of the barricades. The vehicles didn't slow down. 3 young men stepped forward. Dmitry Komar, 23. Ilya Krichevsky, 28. Vladimir Usov, 37. They stood directly in the path of the lead vehicle. Arms spread, bodies as the final barricade. The vehicle didn't stop. The impact killed all 3 instantly, their bodies thrown aside like debris. The armored vehicle lurched to a halt, crew suddenly realizing what they'd done. The other vehicle stopped, reversed, retreated into the darkness. The crowd surrounded the bodies. Silence first, then weeping, then rage. These weren't soldiers. These weren't combatants. These were civilians who believed their bodies could stop history. They were wrong about stopping the vehicles, but they were right about stopping history. News of the deaths spread instantly, through the crowds, across Moscow, to military headquarters where generals were still debating orders, to the Kremlin where the emergency committee was meeting. 3 deaths, 3 martyrs, 3 reasons why the coup had to end. The military's response wasn't celebration, it was horror. Officers who'd been considering following orders suddenly understood what those orders meant. Not abstract concepts like restoring order or dispersing protesters. Concrete reality. Dead bodies. Young men crushed under tank treads. The question that had haunted military headquarters all day became impossible to ignore. Who gives that order? Who takes that responsibility? In the White House, Yeltsin stood at a window, looking down at the 3 bodies covered in Russian flags. He understood what had just happened. The coup plotters had lost, not because of military strategy, not because of political maneuvering, because 3 young men stood in front of tanks and forced everyone to confront the cost of this gamble. Dawn broke over Moscow on August 20th. The defenders remained, the soldiers remained, the tanks remained. But something had changed. The coup leaders could feel it. Their window was closing, their military was fracturing, their legitimacy was gone. By sunrise, they knew they'd lost. The collapse came faster than anyone imagined. 8. The Unraveling. August 21st, 6 a.m. The emergency committee convened in the Kremlin for what would be their final meeting. 8 men who'd believed they could save the Soviet Union. 8 men who'd gambled everything on a plan that was disintegrating in real time. The atmosphere wasn't defiant anymore. It was panic. Yanayev sat at the head of the table, hands trembling worse than at the press conference. He'd been drinking since midnight. It didn't help. Nothing helped. He was supposed to be in charge. He was supposed to be the president. But everyone in the room knew he was a puppet, and the puppet masters had lost control of the strings. Khrushchev, the KGB chief, delivered the military assessment. The Taman division had defected to Yeltsin. The airborne forces refused orders. Alpha Group stood down. The military wasn't just failing to follow orders, it was actively protecting the White House. Yazov, the defense minister, had no response. He'd spent 40 years in the Soviet military. He'd commanded armies. He'd planned operations across continents. Now he couldn't command a single unit to follow his orders. Pugo, the interior minister, was silent. His internal ministry troops were supposed to be the backup, the force that would act when the military hesitated. But they were conscripts too, young men who didn't want to fire on crowds, who didn't want to be remembered as the soldiers who massacred Moscow. The accusations started. Whose fault was this? Who miscalculated? Who promised the military would obey? Khrushchev blamed Yazov for losing control of the military. Yazov blamed Khrushchev for failing to suppress the resistance before it grew. Pugo blamed both of them for underestimating Yeltsin. Yanayev blamed everyone. Then he broke down, weeping. The man who was supposed to be leading a superpower, crying at a conference table because he understood what was coming. Arrest, trial, prison, disgrace. His name forever associated with the coup that failed. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Some argued for escalation, one final push, overwhelming force, consequences be damned. Others argued for negotiation. Reach out to Yeltsin, find a compromise, salvage something from this disaster. No one argued for what they should have argued for: surrender. By mid-morning, the decision was made for them. The military formally withdrew, tanks leaving Moscow, soldiers returning to barracks, not because the emergency committee ordered it, because the generals decided the coup was over. The KGB's betrayal came next. Khrushchev, who'd planned this coup, who'd convinced the others it would work, was arrested by his own agency. KGB officers who'd watched the disaster unfold decided their chairman had gone too far. Self-preservation trumped loyalty. The conspirators scattered. Some fled to military bases, hoping for protection from units that might still be loyal. Some headed to airports, planning escape routes to republics that might harbor them. All of them were going nowhere. Pugo made a different choice. The interior minister returned to his apartment, wrote a final letter, put a gun to his head, pulled the trigger. He understood what the others couldn't accept yet. This wasn't just a failed coup. This was the end of everything they'd built their lives on. The speed of collapse was stunning. 60 hours from coup announcement to total failure. 74 years of Soviet power, undone in a long weekend. The emergency committee had tried to save the Soviet Union through force. Instead, they'd proven something the hardliners never wanted to admit. You can't restore an empire that people no longer believe in. You can't command obedience when soldiers refuse to fire. You can't turn back history with tanks when the tank crews switch sides. The coup was over, but the Soviet Union's collapse was just beginning. The emergency committee's failure created a vacuum, and Boris Yeltsin was ready to fill it. 9. The Return of the Prisoner. August 22nd, 1991, 3 a.m. A government aircraft lifted off from Crimea, carrying Mikhail Gorbachev back to Moscow. 3 days earlier, he'd been the president of a superpower. Now, he was returning to a capital that had moved on without him. Gorbachev expected restoration. He expected gratitude. He expected to resume his position as if the coup had been nothing more than an interruption. A brief crisis, now resolved. He would address the nation, thank those who defended democracy, continue his reforms. He was wrong about everything. The plane landed at Vnukovo Airport at dawn. Gorbachev looked out the window, expecting to see his staff, his ministers, the apparatus of Soviet government ready to welcome him back. Instead, he saw Boris Yeltsin's delegation, Russian Federation officials, not Soviet officials. The message was clear before anyone spoke a word. Yeltsin wasn't there personally. He'd sent representatives. The symbolism was deliberate. Gorbachev was being retrieved, not restored. Rescued, not reinstated. The man who'd been president of the USSR was returning as a guest of the Russian Federation. The motorcade drove through Moscow. Gorbachev stared out the window at a city transformed. The barricades still stood around the White House. Russian flags, not Soviet flags, hung from buildings. Posters of Yeltsin covered walls. The hero of the resistance, the man who stood on the tank, the leader Moscow had chosen. The press conference that afternoon revealed everything. Gorbachev walked into the hall expecting to control the narrative. He would explain what happened, condemn the coup plotters, reassert his authority. Yeltsin had other plans. Gorbachev began speaking, defending his reforms, defending perestroika and glasnost. Then he said something that stunned everyone watching. The Communist Party can be reformed. We must continue working within the system. The room erupted. Journalists shouting questions. How could he defend the party? The party had just tried to overthrow him. The party's hardliners had held him prisoner. The party was responsible for this entire disaster. Yeltsin stood, walked to the podium, didn't ask permission, simply took over. He held up documents, the emergency committee's orders, the coup plans, evidence of who had betrayed Gorbachev. He forced Gorbachev to read them aloud, name by name, crime by crime. The public humiliation was deliberate. "These are the men you appointed," Yeltsin said. "These are the men you trusted. Read their betrayal to the people." Gorbachev read, his voice faltering, his face pale. The man who had been General Secretary of the Communist Party, President of the Soviet Union, reduced to reading his enemy's treachery aloud while his rival stood beside him. Raisa Gorbachev sat in the front row. Her eyes told the story her husband couldn't accept. She understood what he didn't. They'd lost, not to the coup plotters, to history, to Yeltsin, to the simple fact that Moscow had defended itself without them and didn't need them anymore. The power shift was complete. Gorbachev had the title. Yeltsin had the authority. Gorbachev had the office in the Kremlin. Yeltsin had the loyalty of the people, the military, the government that mattered. Gorbachev returned from Crimea. but Yeltsin ruled Moscow, and while this drama played out in the capital, the republics were making their own calculations. The coup had proven something crucial. Moscow couldn't protect them. Moscow couldn't control them. Moscow couldn't stop them. It was time to leave. 10. The dominoes begin to fall. August 24th, 1991, 6 p.m. The Verkhovna Rada, Ukraine's parliament, convened in emergency session in Kyiv, the largest Soviet republic after Russia. 52 million people, the breadbasket of the empire, the industrial heartland. Without Ukraine, the USSR was a geographic fiction. The deputies had watched Moscow's drama unfold on television. They'd seen the tanks. They'd seen Yeltsin on the tank. They'd seen the coup collapse. They'd drawn their conclusions. Leonid Kravchuk, Ukraine's parliamentary chairman, called for a vote, not a referendum. Not a debate scheduled for December as previously planned. An immediate declaration of independence. The calculation was brutally simple. The August coup proved Moscow couldn't protect them, couldn't control them, couldn't stop them. If hardliners could seize the Kremlin and hold the president prisoner, what did Soviet power actually mean? What was the Union worth if it could be overthrown in an afternoon? The vote wasn't close. 346 deputies in favor, 6 against. Ukraine declared independence. Not someday, not after negotiations, now. The announcement sent shockwaves through what remained of the Soviet government. Gorbachev had spent months negotiating a new Union treaty, offering the republics more autonomy, more control over their own affairs, trying to hold the USSR together through compromise. Ukraine didn't want compromise. Ukraine wanted out. Hours later, Belarus followed. Stanislav Shushkevich, the parliamentary chairman, made the announcement with characteristic understatement. No grand rhetoric, no revolutionary fervor, just a simple statement. Belarus was independent. The decision was final. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, had declared independence months earlier. Moscow had refused to recognize it, sent troops to suppress it, threatened consequences. Now those threats meant nothing. The coup's failure validated everything the Baltics had claimed. The Soviet Union couldn't hold its republics by force. It couldn't maintain the empire through intimidation. The August crisis proved the emperor had no clothes. Western nations, which had hesitated to recognize Baltic independence, suddenly moved. The United States announced recognition. The European community followed, not because the legal situation had changed, because the political reality had. In Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev watched the cascade, the second largest Soviet republic. Vast territory, massive resources, nuclear weapons on its soil. Nazarbayev had been cautious. He'd supported Gorbachev's reforms. He'd argued for preserving the Union in some form. Now he was calculating differently. Ukraine was gone. Belarus was gone. The Baltics were gone. What was he preserving? What union remained? The mathematical reality was inescapable. The USSR consisted of 15 republics. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan represented 80% of the territory and 70% of the population. Without them, the Soviet Union was a name on a map with no substance behind it. Gorbachev made desperate calls, pleading, negotiating, offering everything: more autonomy, economic concessions, constitutional reforms, anything to keep the republics from leaving. The republic leaders were polite. They thanked him for his years of service. They praised his reforms. They acknowledged his good intentions. Then they hung up and continued planning their independence. The Soviet Union wasn't collapsing in a single dramatic moment. It was dissolving in a cascade. Each republic's departure made the next departure easier. Each declaration of independence proved Moscow couldn't stop them. Each defection weakened the center, until there was no center left. Gorbachev sat in his Kremlin office, president of a union that was evaporating around him. He had the title, he had the nuclear briefcase, he had the office and the staff and the trappings of power. But he didn't have a country anymore. The Soviet Union was dying, not from the coup, from what the coup revealed. An empire held together by force and fear and ideology. When the force failed, when the fear evaporated, when the ideology collapsed, nothing remained. The 7 days in August had set this in motion. The conspirators tried to save the Soviet Union. Instead, they proved it was already dead. 11. The impossible negotiation. Late August 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev sat in his Kremlin office, surrounded by phones that wouldn't stop ringing and Republic leaders who wouldn't answer his calls. He was trying to negotiate the survival of a country that no longer existed. The Union Treaty meetings became exercises in futility. Gorbachev would propose frameworks for a reformed Soviet Union, more autonomy for republics, economic independence, cultural sovereignty, everything short of actual independence. The Republic leaders would nod politely, thank him for his time, then return home and continue their exit plans. Kazakhstan's Nazarbayev was the only one still taking Gorbachev's calls seriously, not because he wanted to preserve the USSR, because he was calculating what independence would cost Kazakhstan and whether the price was worth paying. He'd decide soon enough. The answer would be yes. Meanwhile, Boris Yeltsin was building a shadow government. The Russian Federation wasn't waiting for the Soviet Union to collapse. It was actively replacing it. Soviet ministries woke up to find Russian Federation officials occupying their offices, not through force, through bureaucratic reality. The Russian government controlled the resources. The Soviet government controlled paperwork. The Defense Ministry discovered its orders were being ignored, not because of insubordination, because military units were asking a simple question: who pays our salaries? The answer was Russia, not the USSR. Loyalty followed the money. The Finance Ministry found its authority evaporating. Russia controlled the banks. Russia controlled the currency reserves. Russia controlled the economic infrastructure that made the Soviet government function. The Foreign Ministry watched Western leaders call Yeltsin, not Gorbachev. Ambassadors sought meetings with Russian officials, not Soviet ones. The international community was making its choice about which government mattered. The most dangerous question loomed over everything. Who commands the nuclear weapons? The Soviet Union possessed over 27,000 nuclear warheads, strategic missiles in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, tactical weapons scattered across a dozen republics, submarines at sea carrying enough firepower to end civilization. The command structure assumed a unified Soviet government, a clear chain of command from the General Secretary through the Defense Ministry to the military units that controlled the weapons. That chain was breaking. Ukraine was independent. Belarus was independent. Kazakhstan was considering it. Who controlled the nuclear weapons on their territory? Who had the authority to launch them? Who could stop a launch if someone gave the order? Western intelligence agencies watched in terror. The nightmare scenario wasn't Russian aggression. It was Soviet collapse creating a nuclear free-for-all. Warheads in newly independent states with unclear command structures. Officers with launch authority but no government to report to. The most dangerous weapons ever created, scattered across a disintegrating empire. Gorbachev tried to reassure Washington, London, Paris. Everything was under control. The nuclear arsenal was secure. The command structure remained intact. No one believed him, because it wasn't true. The Communist Party faced its final days. The organization that had ruled the Soviet Union for 74 years, That had survived civil war, world war, purges and power struggles. That had outlasted Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev. Gorbachev signed the decree on August 29th, suspending all Communist Party activities, freezing party assets, ending the organization's role in Soviet governance. The ideological heart stopped beating, not through revolution, not through violence, through a signature on a document. The Supreme Soviet, the Soviet Parliament, voted to confirm the suspension. The party that had never allowed opposition, never permitted dissent, never tolerated challenge, voted itself into irrelevance. But formal endings required one final meeting, one final betrayal. 3 men in a forest, about to finish what the August coup had started. 12. The Forest Conspiracy. December 8, 1991. 3 men arrived at a hunting lodge in Belovezha Forest, Belarus, dense woods on the Polish border, a compound built for Soviet officials who wanted privacy, isolated, secure, perfect for ending an empire. Boris Yeltsin represented Russia, Leonid Kravchuk represented Ukraine, Stanislav Shushkevich represented Belarus, the Slavic core of the Soviet Union, the republics that had founded the USSR in 1922. Now they were here to dissolve it. No grand hall, no ceremony, no television cameras, just 3 men, their advisors, and a document that would erase a superpower from the map. The meeting wasn't secret. The world knew it was happening. But the outcome wasn't predetermined. Gorbachev still believed he could salvage something. A loose confederation, an economic union, some framework that preserved the Soviet name even if the Soviet reality was gone. The 3 leaders had other plans. They'd spent months watching Gorbachev negotiate, offering concessions, proposing reforms, trying to hold together something that no longer existed. They were done negotiating, done pretending, done maintaining the fiction. The document was drafted in hours, clear language, no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The USSR as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality no longer exists. Not is being reformed, not is being restructured, no longer exists. Present tense, immediate, final. The 3 men signed. Yeltsin's signature was bold, confident. Kravchuk's was careful, deliberate. Shushkevich's was matter-of-fact, as if he were signing routine paperwork rather than ending 70 years of history. The Belovezha Accords created the Commonwealth of Independent States, a loose association of former Soviet republics. No central government, no unified military, no Soviet Union. Just independent nations agreeing to cooperate on practical matters, borders, trade, nuclear weapons management. The phone call to Gorbachev came next, not asking permission, not seeking approval, informing him. The decision was made. The Soviet Union was over. His presidency was over. His entire reason for being in the Kremlin was over. Gorbachev's response was exactly what they expected. Legal arguments, constitutional protests, the words of a man with no power trying to assert authority he no longer possessed. You have no right to do this. This violates Soviet law. This requires approval from... Yeltsin interrupted. Mikhail Sergeyevich, it's done. The second call went to George H.W. Bush, the President of the United States, Yeltsin announcing the USSR's death before Gorbachev could, establishing immediately who spoke for the former Soviet space, who controlled the nuclear arsenal, who led the nation that mattered. Bush's response was cautious but clear. The United States would work with the new reality, would recognize the independent republics, would help manage the transition. But the message underneath was obvious. Washington was calling Yeltsin now, not Gorbachev. The historical irony was perfect. The August coup plotters tried to save the Soviet Union through force, Through tanks and emergency decrees and military power, they failed spectacularly. 3 men ended it with a signature, in a hunting lodge, in a forest, with no violence, no drama, just a document that stated what everyone already knew. The Soviet Union was dead. It had been dying since August, since the moment the coup collapsed, since the moment the military refused to fire, since the moment the republics realized Moscow couldn't stop them from leaving. The Bellavazia Accords simply made it official. The empire that had terrified the West for 70 years, that had ruled half of Europe, that had commanded the world's largest military, gone. Not through war, not through revolution, through 3 signatures on a piece of paper. All that remained was the final ceremony, the formal end, the moment when the Soviet flag came down and Mikhail Gorbachev accepted what he'd been denying for months. His country no longer existed, and he was about to become the last leader of a nation that had already disappeared. 13. The Last Day of Empire, December 25th, 1991, 7 p.m. Moscow time. Mikhail Gorbachev sat in his Kremlin office for the final time. The desk was clear, papers removed, personal items packed. The office that had belonged to general secretaries since Lenin looked empty, stripped, ready for its next occupant. A television camera faced him. One last address to the Soviet people, one last chance to explain, to defend his choices, to say goodbye to a country that no longer existed. Gorbachev's face showed the weight of everything that had happened, the reforms that unleashed forces he couldn't control, the coup that proved the old guard would rather destroy the USSR than let it change, the republics that left one by one until nothing remained. 6 years of trying to save the Soviet Union by transforming it, 6 years that ended here. He began speaking. His voice was steady, but the words carried defeat. Dear compatriots, I hereby discontinue my activities at the post of President of the USSR. The resignation wasn't dramatic. No anger, no bitterness, just acceptance of the inevitable. He defended his choices. Glasnost had given people freedom. Perestroika had attempted economic reform. The end of the Cold War had brought peace. He'd tried. History would judge whether he'd succeeded. But the Soviet Union was gone. The republics had chosen independence. The Bellavazia Accords had made it official. His presidency had no country to preside over. His title had no meaning. His office had no power. I am concerned about the fact that the people in this country are ceasing to become citizens of a great power. The consequences may be very difficult for everyone. The speech lasted 11 minutes. Gorbachev's final words as president of a superpower. His final moment in the office that had belonged to Stalin, to Khrushchev, to Brezhnev. His final act as leader of the USSR. At 7:32 p.m., the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the final time. The red banner with hammer and sickle, the symbol that had flown over Moscow since 1922. The flag that had represented revolution, terror, victory, empire. 74 years of Soviet power ended as the flag came down. The Russian tricolor rose in its place. White, blue, red. The colors of the Russian Empire before the Soviet Union. The colors of the Romanovs, history completing a circle. The empire before the empire returning. Inside the Kremlin, the nuclear briefcase transfer took place. The most dangerous handoff in history. Gorbachev to Yeltsin. The codes that could launch 27,000 nuclear warheads. The authority to end civilization. Passing from a president without a country to a president of Russia. No ceremony, no speeches. Just a leather case changing hands. The ultimate symbol of power in the nuclear age. Now it belonged to Russia alone. Not the Soviet Union. Not the communist empire. Just Russia. December 26, 1991. The Supreme Soviet convened for its final session, the Soviet Parliament, the body that had rubber-stamped party decisions for decades. Now it would vote itself out of existence. The resolution was simple. The USSR was dissolved. The Belavazia Accords were recognized. The Soviet government ceased to function. The vote was unanimous. No debate, no opposition, just acceptance. The Soviet Union ended not with violence, not with war, but with a vote and a flag. The empire that had terrified the West, that had ruled half of Europe, that had survived World War and Civil War and purges, gone, dissolved, finished. The 7 days in August had set all of this in motion. The coup that tried to save the Soviet Union destroyed it instead. The hardliners' desperate gamble proved the empire was already dead. Everything after August was just formality. Paperwork. The slow acknowledgement of what everyone already knew. Mikhail Gorbachev left the Kremlin that night, the last leader of the Soviet Union, a man without a country, a president without power. History would debate his legacy for generations, revolutionary or failure, visionary or naive, the man who freed Eastern Europe or the man who lost an empire. But on December 25th, 1991, only one thing mattered. The Soviet Union was over. 14. The question that haunts history. The counterfactual haunts every analysis of the Soviet collapse. What if the coup had succeeded? The hardliners had a vision, a return to Brezhnev-era stability, order restored, republics kept in line through force, the Communist Party reasserting control, the Soviet Union surviving as a centralized, authoritarian state, a slower, more controlled reform process, maybe no reform at all. They believed the Soviet people wanted this, craved it. That 70 years of communist rule had created a population that valued security over freedom, order over chaos, the familiar oppression over uncertain liberty. They were catastrophically wrong. But the question remains, if the military had obeyed orders, if the tanks had stormed the White House, if Yeltsin had been arrested or killed, if Alpha Group had carried out the assault, would the coup have succeeded? The evidence suggests no, not because of military failure, because of something deeper, something the hardliners couldn't see. You can't restore what people no longer believe in. The Soviet Union in August 1991 was a system running on empty. The ideology was dead. No one believed in communism anymore, not even party members. The economy was collapsing, shortages, inflation, chaos. The empire was fragmenting. Republics were leaving regardless of what Moscow wanted. The August coup didn't kill a healthy empire. It exposed a corpse. The USSR was already dead. The coup just made everyone realize it. The speed of collapse proves this. 4 months from superpower to memory. 4 months from the coup's failure to the Soviet flag coming down. That's not a functioning state destroyed by a botched coup. That's a hollow shell finally cracking. But the human cost matters, not the violence of revolution. The August coup killed only 3 people. The cost was the chaos of dissolution. 15 new nations forming overnight, economies disintegrating, borders disputed, ethnic conflicts erupting, nuclear weapons scattered across newly independent states. Millions of people suddenly living in countries that didn't exist a year earlier. The republic's paths diverged immediately. Some moved toward democracy, imperfect, struggling, but attempting it. Others moved toward autocracy, new dictators replacing old ones, independence becoming just a change of flags. All moved toward uncertainty. Russia under Yeltsin lurched through the 1990s. Economic shock therapy, oligarchs seizing state assets, Chechnya, the ruble crisis, democracy existing but barely functioning. The chaos the hardliners had warned about became reality, just not the reality they'd predicted. Ukraine struggled to define itself. Independent but economically devastated, politically divided, caught between Russia and the West. The choice made in August 1991 led to conflicts that continue today. The Baltic states integrated with Europe, joined NATO, joined the European Union, their August independence validated, their escape from the Soviet Empire complete. Central Asia saw authoritarian leaders consolidate power. Independence from Moscow, but not independence for their people. The Soviet system replaced by personal dictatorships. The question for today matters more than historical debate. Was the Soviet collapse inevitable? Or did 8 men's miscalculation destroy an empire that might have survived? The answer, the evidence suggests, the USSR was dying. Gorbachev's reforms had unleashed forces that couldn't be controlled. The republics were leaving, the economy was failing, the ideology was exhausted. But the coup killed it, accelerated the death, proved that force couldn't save the empire, showed the world and the Soviet people that Moscow had no power left. 7 days in August, when desperate men tried to stop history and instead accelerated it. When tanks in Moscow streets proved powerless against defiance. When an empire that had survived 70 years collapsed because its own people stopped believing in it. The empire that died twice. The Soviet Union died twice. Once in August when the coup failed, once in December when the formalities ended. The 7 days that mattered were August 19th through 26th, when tanks in Moscow streets proved powerless against defiance, when generals refused to fire on their own people, when an empire discovered it had no power left except the power people granted it. The lesson transcends the Soviet Union. Empires don't end when they lose wars. They end when their own people stop believing in them, when the soldiers won't follow orders, when the citizens choose resistance over submission, when the cost of maintaining control exceeds the value of what's being controlled. The haunting image remains. Gorbachev's face on December 25th, the last leader of a nation that no longer existed, a man who tried to save his country by transforming it and lost everything instead. If you want to understand how superpowers collapse, subscribe for more stories of empires that thought they were eternal.